So we are thrilled to have Virginia Chang here with us today. She's going to be talking about getting comfortable with death. The description is facing one's mortality is not something to be fearful of, but an opportunity to find meaning and embrace life by being prepared for death. So you're going to come learn how society got to where it is today in terms of death and its attitudes, and what you can do to cope when faced with death or the deaths of loved ones. Virginia's background is that she's been trained by the University of Vermont, Larner College of Medicine, the International End of Life Doula Association, and the Visiting Nurse Service of New York. She completed the INELDAS rigorous certificate process in August of 2019. She's currently working as an end-of-life doula privately and a hospice vigil volunteer for VNSY program as a doula instructor. She's passionate about sharing the knowledge that is gained and as an end-of-life doula with others. She sits on the VNSNY's Ethics Committee and Review Board and advises on matters of ethical significance to its hospice and palliative care program. Virginia also is working to address racism and disparity in the end-of-life care and in the doula field through the ILDA's Council of Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion. Their goal is to be responsive to issues of equality and diversity in its offerings, as well as to address the need for greater inclusion of underserved populations. Her formal education includes an SB in chemistry from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and an MA and PhD in organic chemistry from Stanford University. She had two previous careers, one as a research scientist specializing in new drug design for the pharmaceutical industry, and then as a chemical contamination expert in the environmental field. As a result, Virginia has the ability to have a fine focus on issues while maintaining a broad perspective. She's a long-term learner and an academic at heart. More recently, Virginia was a stay-at-home mother, raising two terrific children. So Virginia, I do not think you are qualified enough to join us today. I think you need a little bit more of a background. We are so thrilled to have you. Thank you so much. And the floor is yours.
So thank you so much, Jillian, for that kind introduction. Thank you, Jillian, Rachel, and Sherry for inviting me to come to speak with you all today. I mean, it is really lovely to see all your faces, and I'm really, really happy to be with you here today. So I am going to share my screen. So let me get to that. Oh. Okay, so the title of my talk is Getting Comfortable with Death. So I will be talking about death, and I'm going to be bringing it down to a very personal level. We're going to try to get comfortable with what happens during the illness journey and the concept of death. I understand this material may be triggering for some of you, and if it will bring up some strong emotions, and that's okay. So if you need to step away and gather yourself, that's all right. You can also have a box of tissues handy. So you are all here today because you either have been or you have a loved one who's been diagnosed with cancer. So do you think thoughts of death? Do you wonder what dying is going to be like? 1 in 8 of us believe in immortality. I think that's a pretty high statistic. It's amazing to think that 1 in 8 of us. So even in just this group, there's at least 1 or 2 of you believe in immortality. But as far as I know, there's no elixir of life or fountain of youth. We all are going to die, guaranteed. Maybe sometimes you feel this close to death. I'm okay, but are you okay? And if you're not okay, that's okay too. So we as a society, we're not very good at talking about death, but talking about death can help affirm what's important about life. Facing one's mortality is an opportunity to find meaning and to embrace life by being prepared for death. Now, I'm going to start by giving you a brief history of the important events that got us to where we are today in terms of our attitudes and beliefs about deaths, because it's important for you to understand that the way you're thinking has been shaped by history and society. Then I'm going to talk about how we die currently in the 21st century. I'm going to move on to talk about what an end-of-life doula is, which is the work that I do. And then I'm going to end with talking about coping strategies when facing death in yourself or in loved ones. So talking about death has become rather taboo. Although I think with the COVID pandemic, we've been confronted every day with death in the news. How many people have died, death rate statistics, and especially with COVID, the way people have died. And I think this has really brought a heightened awareness of death and dying currently. But let's go back and start from the very beginning. Throughout human history, up until the mid-1800s, families and communities cared for their own dead, preparing, dressing, and even displaying their dead loved ones in the home. And this was always the practice, to be with your loved one as they died. Now, here I'm talking about typical death. Consequently, death was a common occurrence, and it was really considered a part of daily life. Now, societies have always had a fascination with death, and this is probably best exemplified by the ancient Egyptians, who really perfected the art of embalming. So embalming is the process of preserving a body to delay the natural breakdown of the cells, which begin upon death. So essentially, embalming temporarily prevented the processes that causes our bodies to decay. Today, embalming is not a natural process, but uses a toxic mix of preserving chemicals, which are injected into the body after the fluids have been drained. Now, although the ancient Egyptians were the most common and largest civilization that was fascinated with death, there have been many other cultures that are also fascinated with death, also known as the ancient Greeks and their whole mythology of the Greek underworld, Hades. There's also been the Vikings and their Norse afterlife in Valhalla, as well as the more popular and more current Mexico and the Dios de la Muerta. But moving forward, I'm going to talk about what happened in the mid-1800s that has now changed and shaped everything about the way we think about death up until today. This discussion moving forward is really going to focus on a Western point of view, and even more specifically on an American viewpoint about death and dying. And the reason for this is because I want you guys to understand how you got to where you are today in your thinking about death. So attitudes about death really changed a lot over time. And the thinking right up until before the mid-1800s was that it was unnatural to intervene in the body's decomposition at death. But the Civil War changed all of that thinking. Oh, so sorry, didn't mean to change that slide. Oh, wow, we really moved on. Okay, hold on. The Civil War really changed all of that thinking. What happened during the Civil War is that so many people died away from home, but on the homeland. So families felt like the deaths were really close, that they wanted to just have one last look at their loved ones. And what resulted is that embalming gained legitimacy during this time. And it was really until when President Lincoln died in 1865, when his body was embalmed and he was taken on a cross-country train trip. It was called the funeral train. And it was a time for the country to sort of honor and pay homage to this great president. And it was that cross-country train trip that really changed sort of the whole national popular belief that embalming was acceptable. So then moving on to, okay, can you just, I seem to have lost my cursor. Okay, I've lost my cursor because I want to highlight on the screen and I can't seem to do that. Hold on. Okay, this is, oh, got it. Okay, here we go. There's my cursor. So then this was the way the country sort of went on for another 100 years. And then in the mid-1900s, there was the convergence of three factors that led to major changes in handling death. And what happened? Urbanization was probably the first biggest factor, is that people started to move from the country to the city. And this was primarily driven by advancements in manufacturing in the early 1900s, and then America's involvement in World War II. The second major factor was medical advances. There were great discoveries in medical treatment of illness and in medical technology. Primarily what you've heard is the discovery of penicillin. And then the other major discovery was the use of X-rays as a diagnostic tool for, identifying illnesses and disease. The third major factor was the funeral industry. There was a big push by the funeral industry to professionalize. So what was the result of these three factors converging at the same time in the mid-1900s? Is that death became medicalized, institutionalized, and sanitized. So medicalized, because of urbanization and medical advances, when people got sick, they didn't go home, they went to the hospital. And this moved healthcare from the local doctor who made house calls to hospitals. So consequently, people died in the hospital. And then with all the medical advances, the practice of medicine shifted to curing disease and sickness. And consequently, there was a big push to save lives. Institutionalized, people died away from home and they began dying in hospitals, facilities, asylums, care homes. And now they were cared for by professionals rather than the family. Sanitized. Death, dying, and decay started to be considered unpleasant because people just were not around it as much. There was also big propaganda that was put out by the funeral industry to promote the idea that death was no longer something that you as a family had to deal with anymore. And so this is the way that the majority of people began to die, and they still do today, which is that you're hooked up to life-sustaining machines in a sterile hospital room, devoid of comfort, familiarity, and meaning, either alone or in the presence of strangers. After death, your body is brought to the funeral home where your blood is drained, your organs are sterilized, and your body is refilled with a toxic mix of embalming fluid to halt the decomposition process. Friends and families come to the funeral home to mourn, and then they return home to a place that feels very empty and devoid of the deceased. So according to Stanford University School of Medicine palliative care, 80% of Americans would prefer to die at home if possible. But in reality, 60% of Americans die in acute care facilities like the picture shown here. This stat actually used to be higher, even as much as 80%, but it's been coming down a lot in the past decade. For the remaining 40%, 20% die in nursing homes, and the other 20% die at home. Of course, I understand that not every patient wants to die at home, perhaps due to cultural reasons or out of just concern for your family. The point that I'm trying to make is that fewer patients are
the wisdom of the I think it's certainly
okay. So the point that I'm just trying to make is that fewer patients are dying at home than ever before. and fewer patients are dying at home that want to do so. So with any great societal change, there's always resistance, right? This is common. And this resistance took the form of the hospice movement in the 1960s. Now, hospice care is a philosophy of care. It's not a place. Hospice is a philosophy of care at the end of life that focuses on quality of life and comfort. And it's usually defined as having less than 6 months to live. There were some great leaders of the hospice movement. I've just mentioned 4 of them here, which is Dame Cicely Saunders. She really recognized the concept of suffering at death. She saw that people were suffering at death, and she said, this is unacceptable. She set up the very first modern hospice, St. Christopher's in England in 1967, and it still exists there today. Florence Wald was the dean of Yale School of Nursing. She went to actually study with Dame Cicely Saunders, and she brought back the hospice concept to America. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which is someone whose name you might be familiar with, she really pioneered the understanding of the way we die and grief. She recognized that 75% of the population is dying very lonely, miserable, angry, isolated, and alienated. She recognized this in 1960, but that statement sounds pretty familiar with the way people were dying during COVID just a year or 2 ago. Val Formant was a surgeon out of McGill University in Canada, and he also went to study with Dame Cicely Saunders in England, and he brought the hospice concept into the hospital setting. And he basically created the branch of palliative care medicine, which is now a branch of medicine that is focused on managing symptoms and side effects of illness. In the early 2000s, the end-of-life doula movement was born, and this was founded by several people in different parts of the countries who were non-medical professionals who were supporting dying people, and they asked themselves, we can do death better than this. How can we? And this is the beginning of the end-of-life doula movement. So as you can see, it's only really been recent. We're not even 20 years old. And then in 2013, there was a mortician in Los Angeles. She's a young goth influencer, and she tweeted, she was in a conversation about sex positivity and body positivity, and she tweeted and she said, why can't we have death positivity? And consequently, out of that one tweet, the positive death movement was formed. And it is defined as encouraging people to speak openly about death and dying. And it embraces accepting death and decay as part of the natural world. So death positive deaths look more like this. The family is involved in caring for their own, and they're involved in the dying process. For the dying person, that means that they're surrounded by family and loved ones. Death positive deaths emphasize quality at end of life and not taking extreme measures to extend life.
Going to watch the game.
It honors the wishes of the dying person with regards to medication, treatment, and post-death. And it also encourages natural burials, which recognize that people and death are a natural part of the life cycle. And it's done in the way that promotes the least harm to the environment. Okay, so let's move on to talking about, now we understand the historical perspective. Now you can understand all the history and societal factors that really shaped kind of how you're thinking today. And these are things that shape the way you think today that are beyond your control. So now let's understand how we are dying today. And what does the research show? Turns out there's only 4 ways to die, just 4. I know you find that hard to believe, but I'm going to explain it to you. I'm going to explain it to you using these graphs. These graphs are called death trajectories. and they were first described by Glasner and Strauss in 1965 in a groundbreaking study entitled Awareness of Dying. And the concept is that a dying trajectory will show the change in health status over time as a patient approaches death. So the x-axis, which is this, represents time, which you can think of as like your age. The y-axis is titled function, functionality. We can also think of this as your activity level, how much you're functioning, which can also just be defined as your health. So let's look at the first scenario here. Here you start off your high functioning individual, which is represented by this black line here. Then suddenly something happens and your functioning ability goes to zero. When your ability to function goes to zero, that's the moment of death. So this scenario, number one, describes sudden death, and it's caused by heart attacks, brain aneurysms, fatal accidents, such as car crashes. Okay, this is one way to die, sudden death. In the second death scenario, again, we start off with a high functioning individual. But instead, what we observe is a rapid, constant deterioration of health to death. So the time frame for this scenario is usually weeks to months. This is the time frame. This is this current death scenario for what we're seeing with COVID people. This type of death scenario is also represented by other fast terminal progressing illnesses such as lung cancer and pancreatic cancers. But this is actually what we're seeing right now with COVID. The third scenario, again, we start off with a high functioning individual. But what we see is a slow deterioration of health with periods of improvement. So what's happening here is that you're starting to feel bad and your health declines. And so you go to the doctor. And he might prescribe some medicine, some treatment, a therapy, and so your health goes back up. But after a while, you start to feel bad again, and your health goes down. So you go back to the doctor or the hospital, and you get another treatment or therapy, and you feel better again. What's important to note is that every time your health declines, you feel worse than you did the last time. And after every round of treatment or therapy, you feel better, but you never feel as good as the last time. And so your health is on this slow, steady, sinusoidal up and down decline. The time frame for this type of death is usually years. This type of deaths is represented by organ failure diseases, such as heart failure, liver and kidney failures, as well as many of the women's gynecological cancers. The fourth and last way you can die is a bit different. Here, you start off with a low functioning person. This might be someone who's very old, or this can be someone who has a chronic illness for most of their life, so their activity level is low. Then what you see is a very, very, very slow decline in health. Time frame here is years, many, many years. People who die this way usually die of old age, or people who have become immobile or bedridden. Also, many people who have mental illnesses, such as Parkinson's and dementia, die in this trajectory. So now that you understand how we die and that there are only 4 ways to die, what I'd like to ask you is if you could choose which way would you like to die? Would you like to die by number 1, a sudden death? Number 2, a terminal illness. 3, an organ failure, or 4, what we call frailty. So think in your mind, choose a way, like if it was in your control and you could choose which way you would choose to die. Now, let's take a moment to notice if you chose a trajectory, and for those of you who are ill, if you chose a trajectory that is consistent with your illness's trajectory, or did you choose something that was different? So for many of the women who are here and have gynecological cancers, if you didn't choose number 3, I ask you to consider, why did you choose another trajectory if it was within your control? And what was it about that other trajectory that appealed to you? And what is it about number 3 that you don't like? So these are things that I'm asking you to consider. We don't have to, we can discuss it later when we have like an open discussion question, but it really gives an insight to how you think about what's happening to you. So my experience and the data show that most people choose number 1.
Yeah.
Okay, most people would prefer to die sudden death. Yet, most people actually die now, according to number 3, followed closely by number 4. It's projected that eventually up to 60% of people will die by number 4 due to advancements in medical treatment and technology. So we're moving towards living longer and longer, but really, is that what people want? The whole point of this is to ask yourself, is how you would like to die may be so different to how we will die. Why are these two concepts so far apart? So after understanding how we're going to die, do you feel like death is a little bit out of your control?
Yes.
Like you can't control what's happening? Or is it within your control?
No.
So I'm going to shift and talk about death in a way that hopefully allows us to have more control, some control in the process. So I believe that end of life should be positive, meaningful, and affirming, and that anyone who wants support or presence at the end of life should not go without. What does this mean? That we can all strive to die in a more positive manner with meaning and peace of mind. Now, if you ask me, that's probably the goal for most people. But in my experience, it is not. So I'll just tell you my personal story. In late 2016 and early 2017, 3 people very close to me died within the period of 7 months. My father died in September, my mother-in-law died in January, and then my own mother died in April. And it was my first real experience with death, and I was wholly unprepared. I mean, people say that one death is traumatic, and I just had like one death right after another. I never had a chance to catch my breath. I felt a huge sense of powerlessness and hopelessness. These are the 2 adjectives that I use to describe this time, which is just, they're like really strong adjectives, which, you don't want to feel that. Those are the kinds of adjectives that you use to remember this time of your loved ones passing away. But I remember feeling this huge sense of powerlessness and hopelessness watching my loved ones die. I really felt like I was a bystander. And I can tell you that not all the deaths went well. And that was a big problem because you watch your loved ones die in a pretty horrific way, and you feel powerless and hopeless watching the situation unfold. And that's why I became an end-of-life doula, is because I want to work with people during this time in their lives. I want to work with families during this time when they've been diagnosed with an illness that eventually leads to death, or when their health begins to show signs of decline. And I want to bring a different approach to the way we can die, which is that it can be positive, it can be meaningful, and it can be affirming. So what is an end-of-life doula? Most people are really familiar with the concept of doula as it relates to birth doulas, and maybe some of you out there have had personal experiences with birth doulas. I mean, what do birth doulas do? Birth doulas guide, support, they educate, and they companion pregnant women through the transition to being a mother. End-of-life doulas do the exact same work, which is we guide, support, we educate, and we companion people at the other end of the spectrum of life, not at birth, but at death. So here's one definition of an end-of-life doula, which is that we provide non-medical, holistic support and comfort to the dying person and their family, which may include education and guidance, as well as emotional, spiritual, or practical care from as early as initial diagnosis through bereavement. The University of Vermont end-of-life doula program where I teach at, we defined end-of-life doulas as supporting clients with individualized, compassionate care in a number of ways, including emotional, spiritual, informational, and physical support, which greatly helps to lower stress levels, aid in comfort, and promote personalized, even positive dying passages for clients and their loved ones. So I liken my work to that of a birth doula, which everyone seems to be familiar with. So just like at births, when families and communities come together to celebrate a new life brought into this world, I believe families and communities can come together to celebrate and honor a life lived at death. It can be a sacred time. So I subscribe to the Anelda model of care, which describes 3 phases of doula involvement in the dying process to death. There's the before death phase, which can occur weeks, months to years before death, when a diagnosis has been made and you know that death is eventual, or even years before, when you're still a healthy person and you just want to be prepared for death in case you die by death scenario number 1, the sudden death. Doulas can also be involved in the during death period, which is the 48 to 72 hours before death. And this is a phase called active dying. This is the time when you would implement the dying person's vision of what we call a good death. And this usually gets done in what we call a vigil plan. This can allow for a very peaceful passage for the dying person and their loved ones. The third phase of doula involvement is the after death, where a doula might be involved in the early grief with the family and the loved ones. This can usually last anywhere between 3 weeks to 3 months after the death. Grief will always exist, years. Grief never goes away. But you learn to adapt. If grief becomes so debilitating that you can't function, then usually I would recommend that you have to bring in a professional grief counselor. But usually doulas can be involved in a lot of the early grief. So I'm just going to quickly go through each of the 3 phases briefly, talk about the tasks, the objectives, the hoped for outcomes, and then I want to just sort of illustrate the impact a doula can have in a death through a case study. So the before death phase is really about getting to know each other, building trust, really learning about who you are as a person, talking about the meaning of your life, what purpose you have, showing that you have had meaning, that you have impacted people, looking at your legacy, looking at whether you have any unfinished business, any regrets or guilts that's going to come in the way of being able to approach death with peace of mind, unresolved family issues. And it's really important now to really understand who you are as an individual. What are your values and beliefs? And these can range from cultural, spiritual, religious, because these will become the important factors in your decision-making, and that will really allow you to create a death that is representative of yourself, that will allow others to celebrate who you are as an individual. The before death phase is also the time we develop the vigil plan, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. This is, doing all of this before the death can really give a sense of completion. And again, going back to the values and belief, it allows the death process to be reflective of your own values. So let's talk about the vigil plan. The vigil plan is something that is implemented in the active dying phase, which is the 48 to 72 hours before death. A vigil plan allows the dying person to predetermine where they will die, who will be present, and what the environment will be like, incorporating meaningful elements into it, all in accordance with your wishes. So the doula, in conjunction with the family or the loved ones, would implement the vigil plan at the time the dying person approaches active dying. So since the family is often very emotional and exhausted, it's often the job of the doula to hold that space and ensure the elements of the vigil plan are implemented and respected by everyone present. Having a vigil plan in place really helps to set the scene for a peaceful death. It also ensures that every dying person is not alone at their last breath if they so wish. And probably more importantly, for coping, it helps the family and the loved ones to embrace the experiencing of witnessing the final death. Rather than being fearful, you could embrace it. And this is going to be highlighted in the case study that I'm going to talk about in a second. The last phase is the after death. Oftentimes families are so wrapped up in their own grief that they may fail to notice subtle things said or done during the act of dying. So for instance, a pet nearby, or somebody came to visit, or a symbolic gesture, or even just a shift in the energy of the room of what's happening. So the role of the doula is that time is to witness and then to transfer our observation and memories of the event to the family post-death. This can often really help to provide clarity on things that were overlooked or missed when the family is simply unable or overwhelmed to see these things. This kind of debriefing is often very comforting and reassuring to the family because, families want to talk about the death of their loved ones. So one small piece of advice to you: if you're ever confronted with being with someone who just lost a loved one, talk about their loved one. Please talk about their loved one, because not talking about it, it's like you're pretending that that deceased person didn't exist. So I want to put everything that I've just told you into context by talking about a case study. I do actually have a few case studies of women who've died of gynecological cancers or with breast cancers. But in those cases, I was actually called in very late stage, and there's only so much you can do. In those cases, my aim is to create a sacred, peaceful space for the dying person and to try to pull the family together to embrace the experience. What I'd like to do is give you a case study of a man who died of heart failure, which is also number 3 trajectory of dying. But I got to work with him for 7 months, in his last 7 months. And in that time, there's so much more that you can do to prepare, not just physically, but more importantly, mentally, to face death. So I'd like to just tell you his story of Sherman. Sherman was an amazing, incredibly active man. He was a marathon runner. He was an avid cyclist. He was a classical pianist. In the beginning, when I first met Sherman, we went through sort of that phase 1 where we built trust. He told me his life story. We explored the meaning of his life. We discussed his cultural, spiritual, and religious values and beliefs. And we determined the importance of these values and belief in decision-making about himself, his health, and his family. And I became what you could call his objective advocate. And I'm able to do this because I'm neutral and I don't have that long history with him. And I also believe in your capacity to determine always what's best for yourself. After working with Sherman for about 3 months, he then revealed to me this important revelation. And probably it was a reflection of the fact that we had built trust at that point, but he told me that he was really afraid to die. He was not afraid of the actual physical act of dying, but he was afraid to die because he was afraid for his family. And this is a very common fear of dying, is that you're afraid to die because you're afraid for the ones that you leave behind. So at that point, my work shifted and we began to explore his fear of dying. We talked about it in relationship to his values, hopes, and dreams for his family. We set short-term weekly goals for connection between him and his family, as well as we started a long-term legacy project. Now, we didn't get to finish the legacy project before he died, but when I did speak to his wife, she promised to finish the legacy project for Sherman and to give to their sons. Now, I wasn't actually with Sherman when he died because he had a very strong family support system. But immediately after his death, the first thing the wife asked me was, "Did Sherman ever talk to you about death?" And I said, "Oh, yes, we talked about death a lot." And she told me that Sherman had never talked to death with her. He had never even talked to death with any of his family or even his doctors. And she told me that I must have had a profound effect upon Sherman. And then she told me the story of how he died. So in the last few days of Sherman's death, his fear of dying came out and he raged. He was angry and it was ugly. I mean, his body was deteriorating and things were really traumatic, sad, and ugly. Now you're thinking, why am I telling you this story? Because at some point, something clicked in Sherman's mind and he remembered what is most important to him. Who is most important to him? He called his sons to his bedside. He asked them to go out and buy bottles of chilled champagne. And they spent the afternoon together. His wife, his sons, his daughter-in-laws, and his grandchildren. And they drank champagne. They laughed. They told stories. They got drunk. They talked about the future, and they cried. And then later that evening, Sherman passed away peacefully with his wife by his side. The takeaway from this is that you're in control here. The way that you can be in control here. Like when I spoke to his sons, Sherman's sons, after his death, they didn't remember any of the ugliness of the last days. All they remembered was this incredible afternoon they had spent with their father. And they were like in wonder and awe. They didn't remember any of the ugliness. They just remembered this incredible act by their father. And that last act was Sherman's last gift to his family. And what I want to say is that you are in control here. You have the ability to give that last gift to your family and loved ones. That death doesn't have to be full of fear and sadness. It can be full of wonder and awe. Now, I don't guarantee that it's going to work out like that, but you can only be prepared. So Sherman is just one example of how a death can go. It's just one example of how an end-of-life doula can impact the dying process of a dying person and their loved ones. I mean, ideally, what a doula likes to try to do is to transform a time that looks like the storm on the left to something that's breathtaking on the right. So I'd like to offer a quote here. Dame Cicely Saunders, the founder of the modern hospice movement, summed it up really nicely. She said, "You matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. And we will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but also to live until you die." So that was a lot of information. And I know that we're getting really short on time. I will say quickly that I did tell Jillian that I will stay afterwards if people want to ask questions. I'm sorry that I'm talking so much, but I'm pretty passionate about this subject. I really want to share this information with you. So I'm going to go through this quickly about coping strategies when facing death in yourself and others. You know, what can you do differently? I've found that you cannot help yourself or others to cope with death if you're not comfortable with death yourself. And that means you have to start getting comfortable with death and dying. You have to figure out what death means to you and how you feel about it. So I'm going to offer a 3-step process for getting comfortable with death. The first thing you should do is think about it. Think about your own mortality. Okay, I may be preaching to the choir here. I understand that. But thinking about death doesn't affect the timeline. In fact, thinking about death will give you a more positive attitude, which can affect your health and help you to embrace life more fully. Research studies have shown that people who think about their own mortality daily are in less depressed moods. They show greater engagement in healthy behavior. Healthy behavior means like they exercise more, they smoke less. It's even shown that people will use sunscreen. Greater striving towards living positively. What does that mean? They focus more on improving their relationships with family, friends, and their loved ones, and they start to care about their community and the environment. And research has also shown that thinking about your mortality will result in people demonstrating greater acts of kindness and compassion towards others. I think this is really powerful stuff. It's not like you're going on a diet or you're spending thousands of dollars going to therapy. This is just thinking about your own mortality once a day. Why does this work? It's because it puts things in perspective. Your priorities begin to shift in your personal relationships, your work, your finances, your leisure time. And most importantly, you start appreciate being alive. So think about that. And secondly, talk and write about it. Your understanding and experiences with death will shape your views and your beliefs about death and dying. So let's normalize the topic of death. Talk about this with your family and friends. Talk about what you want and what you don't want for your own death. And find out what your loved ones want for their deaths. In this current world of very aggressive medical treatment to end-of-life care, advanced care planning is so important. It's imperative that you state what your options and preferences are for end-of-life medical care is, and who will speak for you if you're unable to do so. So get your paperwork in order. Think, talk and write. And lastly, care. Let's care for each other. Throughout human history, people died at home. And in their communities, they were cared for by their families and their loved ones. The sick and the elderly were present realities. They weren't removed from daily life. People knew what dying looked like, and it wasn't something terrifying or unknown. We can become less fearful of death, and in doing so, we will be better able to care, to grieve, and to let go. So in my experience, I have found if you are comfortable with death and dying, then you can provide an opening for others. If you're able to talk about death and dying, then you can be an outlet for others to talk about death and dying. And if you're calm, your calmness will allow space for others to express their anxiety and fears about death and dying. So in summary, your presence, your reactions will influence and help others to see death and dying in a new perspective. So I'd like to end this talk, and I think I'm just taking my full time, on a quote. If you're a science fiction fan, you'll very much appreciate this. I'm a science fiction fan, and I'm a big Star Trek fan. And early in the months of self-isolation and COVID, I watched Star Trek Picard on CBS All Access. In the last episode of the first season, Commander Data said this, and when he said it, I just paused, and then I rewound it and replayed it and took down every word just so I could make sure I got it accurately. And he said, mortality gives meaning to human life. Peace, love, friendship, these are precious because we know they cannot endure. So these are just some of the resources and references that back up the research that I talked about. Here are some resources and references to the organizations that support the kind of work that I do. This is my contact information. And I really want to thank you all for listening. And, my heart goes out to each of you. And I just hope that this has offered a new way for you to think about what's happening to each of you, whether it be to yourself or to your loved ones. And I'm going to stop share. And sorry, Jillian, for taking up all the time.
No. I was actually going to thank you and to ask that if anyone had any questions, I know that you said you did have a little time to go over, if that's okay for them to either write in the chat or just raise their hand to ask you, because I think this was a lot of information. It was wonderful. And it really, I think, hits home for everybody. So thank you.